Hi everyone. Welcome to the third episode of our Modern Science Meets Indian Philosophy Soundbites. Today I'm going to speak about OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, and I'll share an interesting connection between how today's popular non-invasive treatments of OCD, specifically ones related to mindfulness behavioral treatments, are grounded on the core tenets of our Indian philosophical system. I'm sure a lot of us have heard the term OCD or even used this term very casually. I know I have, especially when I've forced a friend to climb a flight of stairs to verify if we've, locked the front door or not. Although we may use it casually, it is a very serious mental condition. And only when I researched more about it recently did I understand the magnitude of the mental disorder. So let me give you an example of a person with an extreme version of OCD and also go into a bit of depth into what neural pathways are affected in a patient with an extreme OCD. So I'm going to speak about a patient named Dottie. Her name is changed, but she features in this book titled The Mind and Brain, written by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. Dottie had a serious fear for the numbers 5 and 6. She had such a compulsive or such a crazy fear of numbers 5 and 6 that every time she drove on, the freeway or local roads, she would basically pull over to the side of the road every time she'd see some version of number 5 or 6. It could be on an advertisement banner, it could be on a number plate of another car, and she would wait there on the hard shoulder or on the side of the road until a car with a lucky number passed by. So, to kind of understand the extent of how her OCD consumed her life, a simple trip of 10 minutes from her workplace to her home would take her a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour because she felt compelled to pull over a minimum of 10 to 15 times. And this was a daily occurrence. So, question is, what goes on in the brain for a patient with an extreme OCD? So, I'm going to speak about 3 different regions in the brain that have been identified to play a major role in this whole OCD symptom. So, the 3 regions are the orbital frontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the anterior cingulate cortex. So, the caudate nucleus is a part of the striatum and is responsible for habit formation and inhibitory control. There's the orbital frontal cortex, which is involved in detecting threats and basically sends worry signals every time something is amiss in the environment. So what happens typically is the orbitofrontal cortex is in the forebrain, right? It sends these alarm messages to the caudate nucleus. And in a normal brain, the caudate nucleus will consider that message and it will say, hey, it'll filter that message and say there is no issue, and just the person goes on with their life. But in an OCD brain, this filter doesn't work well. So it doesn't filter the message. So it keeps on bringing up those urges over and over. And in addition, if there were just urges without any emotion attached to it, I think it might be easier to even deal with those urges. But what happens is the anterior cingulate cortex gets added into this loop. And the anterior cingulate cortex is very closely connected to emotions, to fear. So what happens is you have the orbitofrontal cortex sending you error messages. It also kind of triggers the anterior cingulate cortex, which gives you this feeling of fear. Simultaneously, the caudate nucleus doesn't know how to actually filter out that message. So you're constantly sent these urges, but also it comes with an emotion attached to it. And that's when the OCD patient has this constant fear or anxiety or dread that something is amiss and is almost forced to respond with a particular action. Either it could be cleaning their hands regularly or, continuously, or pulling over the car in Dottie's case whenever they see a particular trigger. OCD has been well known in medical circles for a very long time and almost since the early 20th century, but it surprisingly was considered untreatable prior to the 1960s. But from the late 80s, there has been a push towards identifying brain markers for OCD, something similar to what I had mentioned earlier about the 3 circuits in the brain that go awry in OCD patients. And also a lot of emphasis has been placed on mindfulness-based methods for alleviating OCD symptoms. So here I'm going to focus a bit more on the mindfulness treatment for OCD, as I believe it has a very close connection to some of the core tenets of our Indian philosophical system. So please clearly and closely hear me out. A very famous technique that has been introduced in this area is a 4-step procedure, and the 4 steps are titled relabel, reattribute, refocus, and revalue. I'm specifically going to focus on the first three steps. And the first step is relabel. So, the first step in this treatment is where the patient is requested by his therapist to consciously or to take conscious effort to make mental notes of what the obsessive thought was and to describe that exact feeling. It's also called cognitive restructuring. So, in some ways, it is to dissociate. It is requesting the patient to dissociate or detach oneself from the thoughts in the mind and to actively just observe the mind and to document that. The second step is to reattribute, where typically the second step in this treatment is when the consulting doctor shows PET scans. PET is positron emission tomography. So these are scans of the brain, and they show them to the patient and tells the patient that there is a biochemical imbalance in the brain, especially in the caudate nucleus is hyperactive, and that's what is causing these urges to resurface over and over again. And the physicians have noticed that when patients are actually told that there is a biochemical loss of balance in the brain, that's when they have this aha moment when they say, oh, it's my brain that's sending faulty messages. It's not really a me thing. So again, this step with coordination with step one requires or enforces that the patient kind of realize that their intrusive thoughts and urges are due to a faulty wiring of the brain and is not a fundamental problem with themselves. And the third step is to refocus, where the patient, in addition to dissociating from their minds, their thoughts and urges, now they have to take control over their systems and focus it on pleasant or good habits so that they can rewire or rewrite that neural pathway or neural circuit. So I was curious to see if this remained a philosophical concept or a particular procedure, or does it actually have certain clinical benefits. And I came across a very interesting paper in the 90s, written in the late 90s. It was led by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, which had a few patients who suffered from chronic OCD. And there they showed how the brain activity changes post 10 weeks of this structured therapy. So as I mentioned in the start of the talk, the caudate nucleus is the region that gets hyperactivated in the OCD brain. And that can be seen here in this image, where in this PET scan, you can see with a more red intensity that this region is hyperactive. It's it's firing almost every now and then. And it can be seen that this intensity of that same spot, it decreases significantly after the treatment, after the 10-week treatment, kind of suggesting that most patients who enrolled for the study have some preliminary success that this method actually worked for changing activity of this particular region of the brain and potentially changing the wiring associated with that area. In addition, they also took a lot of subjective recording of the experience of OCD patients, and it seems to, based on their survey, it seems like their intrusive thoughts and urges have reduced post-treatment. So I was very curious what inspired the authors of this particular approach to actually propose this particular four-step methodology. And I came across this really cool thing that the authors, they cited that their methods were inspired by the concept called the impartial spectator. And it is a term very well known in philosophical circles, and was introduced by the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith. And here's where I transition to our ancient Indian texts. So the impartial spectator might seem like a very novel concept, especially for our fast-paced world today, but is in fact one of the core tenets of our ancient Indian or Vedic tradition. So based on what I've learned from my teachers, or in traditional circles we call them acharyas, the ABC, the very basics of our Indian philosophical system, especially the Vedantic school, which is one of the 6 schools of the Indian philosophical system, is that we, the conscious living entity, are not our bodies or our mind. Instead, we are actually the witness of what happens in our mind and in our bodies. That is, we are basically the impartial spectator, the witnesser. We're just the experiencer. We have nothing in relation. So let me give you an analogy to better digest or understand that. So let's consider our interaction with a computer. I'm sure every one of us have had this use a computer on a regular basis. So we have a CPU, which is the central processing unit where all the computation takes place. There's the monitor, which displays the output. And then there's the user, that's each one of us, who's actually viewing the stuff that's displayed on the monitor. So in a similar vein, our ancient Indian texts, they suggest that our bodies and brain, they're akin to the CPU, that is all the hardware for all the processing. Then there's the mind, which is akin to the monitor, that is whatever is computed within that brain gets displayed on the screen of the mind. And then the I is the conscious entity that views the screen of the mind, like the user, like the user kind of views the monitor, who's actually playing around with different things and consumes information through that screen. Similarly, the conscious entity, the I, is the one that views that screen of the mind. And it kind of is akin to we're deeply engrossed in a movie that we're viewing on our mind screen. And of course, it seems so real. But our ancient Indian text suggests that it's a very seamlessly designed virtual reality. So, again, another reference to what is becoming more popular these days is with all our innovations in VR, virtual reality, and augmented reality, AR, we might very soon come to a point where we wear those artificial headsets and we'll be convinced that the world we see and manipulate through those headsets is the most real thing for us. Our ancient Indian texts, they allude to the fact that our current senses, the eyes, the ears, the tongue, all of them are akin to headsets that enable this phenomenal virtual reality. I'm always left in astonishment and amazement every time I contemplate on this philosophical fact. Coming to the point, as this is the ABC of our Indian philosophical texts, we have far too many references about the same across our Vedic corpus. So I'm going to cherry pick a few that I've been taught from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. So again, let me remind you, our Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita were composed a minimum of 5,000 years ago. But the wisdom of these texts, I believe, remain as relevant to us as they were then. The first verse is a verse it's a phrase that's picked from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, chapter 4, section 3, verse 15. I have not been trained to recite this in the right meter, so I'm going to just read out the Sanskritam here. Sava esha etasmin samprasade ratva charitva drishtva punyam cha papam cha punah pratinyayam pratiyonyadravati swapnayaiva sa yatatra kinchit pashyat yanan vagatastena bhavati asango hyayam purusha iti evamevaitad Yagyavalkya soham bhagavate sahasram dadami ata urdhvam vimokshayaiva bruhiti. In this verse, the phrase that I'd like to highlight is asango hyayam purushaha iti. In summary, the Vedic aphorism asango hyayam purushaha actually affirms that the living entity is transcendental to this material world and has actually no real connection with the material realm. Sangha basically means connection. Asanga means no connection, and Purusha refers to all living entities. It could also refer to the Supreme, but here it can be interpreted either way, as the entity itself, each one of us, the conscious living entity, or the Supreme. And here I'm going to take the interpretation of the individual living entity. The idea being said is that the living entity, as it has no connection, it basically remains just a witnesser and it just remains a spectator. And that is its constitutional position. There is another beautiful verse that is mentioned in the Khat Upanishad, and this appears in the first Adhyaya, third Valli, verses 3 and 4, that make a beautiful comparison between who we are, that is our body, our mind, the conscious living entity that we are, all of it to a chariot. Atmanam ratitam viddhi shariram ratam evatu buddhim tu saratim viddhi mana pragraham evacha. Indriyani hayanahur vishayam steshu gocharan atmendriyam manoyuktam bhokte yahur manishinaha. So here this Upanishadic verse introduces a wonderful analogy between the body, mind, intelligence, and ultimately the conscious entity, the I, right, to a chariot. Here the senses are compared to the 5 different horses that you see in this figure, right? So the 5 horses compared to the 5 different senses: smell, touch, sight, and so on. The reins of the horses are akin to the mind. So every time the horses or the senses get unruly, it basically starts running in a particular direction. The mind just follows along. And the person who's holding the reins, the chariot driver, is the intelligence. So every time the mind could get unruly, the senses get unruly, the mind follows along, but then the chariot driver has power to either curtail the mind from flowing in any direction. And you see the petrified person sitting on the chariot, that is the I, the conscious entity, the witnesser, this is the experiencer of all those things. The chariot gets pulled in wrong directions, the person remains petrified. The chariot is pulled in the right direction and goes to the right destination, then the experiencer feels joy and happiness. So, uh, this again clearly points out that the I, the conscious entity, is the impartial spectator and just experiences everything that the senses and the mind and the intelligence basically direct when they're directing the chariot in all these different directions. So another statement that comes to mind was one that a friend of mine, a neurosurgeon, kind of told me at some point was as he operated on a lot of different patients, he noticed that sometimes we give these attributes saying, hey, I'm creative, or he's musically adept and musically talented, and so on and so forth. But when a tumor comes in that particular space, which actually affects your creativity or affects your language, he mentioned that these are just basically great gifts that are simply on loan. Kind of again reiterating the idea that, as our ancient Indian texts suggest, the true I, beyond intelligence, mind, body, is purely a witness or a spectator. And before we end, I have to bring a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, the text that is revered as the crown jewel across all Upanishads, into evidence to support the same idea that the conscious entity, I, is beyond the body, has no connection with the body, actually, and but is merely a spectator of the activities and is deeply engrossed in that movie, that virtual movie. So, in the second chapter, verse 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna the reality of who he is. Here's the verse. Dehinosmin yatha dehe kaumaram yovanam jara tatha dehantara praptir dhirastatra namuhyati. Herein Krishna states that the living entity, or the Dehi, the I, the conscious entity, who resides in the body passes through different phases of the body, from being a youth to an adolescent to an old man, kind of pointing to the fact that although our body and its composition has significantly changed since our birth, our experience of the I-ness, right, is always one. Subtly pointing out that we, the living entity, are not our bodies and might feel that way because, again, we are deeply engrossed in that bodily conception. So, to summarize here, our ancient texts across the board, be it the Upanishads, be it the Puranas, be it the Bhagavad Gita, all of them composed a minimum of 5,000 years ago, all are pointing to the fundamental idea that we, or the I, the conscious entity, is constitutionally a spectator, a witness, and has no real connection to anything in this world, be it objects out there in the physical realm, or even to the mind that we interact and try satisfying day in, day out. So, to finally summarize, I know I've touched a lot of topics today, and I'd just like to tie them all together. So, the first thing, we started off by speaking about extreme versions of OCD, how it can consume a person's life. So, medical treatment and attention becomes a necessity at that point. Treatments for OCD involve a lot of different methods. There's pharmacological interventions, as well as there's an element of cognitive behavioral therapy. And some of the core ideas of mindfulness-based therapy for OCD have been derived from the impartial spectator, which is a philosophical idea that was propounded in the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith. And I also referred to a couple of verses from our ancient Indian texts, especially from two Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, that propound this idea of an impartial spectator, especially because it is the starting or the ABCs of our entire Vedantic journey. And that's why there are far too many mentions across our Vedas, Puranas regarding this topic. With this, I'd like to really thank you for all your attention. And also, I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone for not just viewing my videos, but also commenting, reflecting, and asking very meaningful questions that aid in enhancing my own understanding of the topics that I've been sharing through these soundbites. Again, please leave a comment if you'd like to learn something new or if you have certain clarifications. Thank you very much for your time.